In the 1980s, two of the biggest names in personal computing decided to build the future together. IBM had the hardware, Microsoft had the software, and together they were working on an operating system that was supposed to become the next generation of PC computing. Its name was OS/2, but while Microsoft was helping IBM build that future, it was also developing something else, Windows. And when Windows started gaining momentum, the relationship between IBM and Microsoft became harder and harder to maintain. By 1990, the partnership was coming apart, and the decision that followed would help determine which operating system would dominate the PC for decades. To understand why this partnership mattered, we have to go back to 1985. At the time, IBM was already one of the most powerful names in personal computing. Microsoft, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly important because of something IBM desperately needed: software. On August 22, 1985, Microsoft and IBM signed a joint development agreement covering operating systems and system software. The idea was simple. IBM had enormous influence in hardware. Microsoft understood software. So instead of competing, the two companies would work together. And this partnership wasn't supposed to produce just another small software update. They were trying to build the next generation of personal computing. It's worth understanding exactly why both companies needed each other this badly at that specific moment, rather than simply accepting the partnership as an obvious, inevitable pairing. IBM had essentially created the modern personal computer industry with the original IBM PC in 1981, but by the mid-1980s, that dominance was already eroding. Compatible clone manufacturers, starting with Compaq, had reverse-engineered IBM's own published hardware specifications, and were building functionally identical machines at lower prices, steadily commoditizing the very market IBM had invented. IBM needed a next-generation operating system tightly bound to its own hardware advantages, something that could restore genuine technical differentiation in a market increasingly filled with interchangeable competitors. Microsoft's motivation was different, but no less pressing. Microsoft's entire early success had been built on its DOS licensing relationship with IBM, and in the mid-1980s, the company's own leadership genuinely believed it needed IBM's continued blessing and market power to remain relevant against the growing swarm of PC clone manufacturers. Neither company, in that specific moment, felt confident enough to go it entirely alone. But there was already something interesting happening underneath the surface of this new partnership. Microsoft wasn't putting Windows on the shelf. It was continuing to develop it quietly alongside everything it was doing with IBM, and that decision would become extremely important. In 1987, IBM and Microsoft announced OS/2. At the time, it looked like a logical next step. The operating system was designed to move beyond the limitations of the older PC environment. DOS, the system Microsoft's entire early fortune had been built on, could only really run one program at a time, had no proper graphical interface of its own, and was fundamentally constrained by design. Decisions made years earlier, back when personal computers were far less capable than the machines shipping by the late 1980s. OS/2 was meant to fix all of that. Real multitasking, and eventually a proper graphical interface called a presentation manager, developed collaboratively between the two companies' own engineering teams. And because IBM and Microsoft were working together, OS/2 had something extremely valuable behind it. Two of the largest, most influential technology companies on the planet, both fully committed to the same platform. The expectation, reasonably enough, was that this partnership could define the next entire era of personal computing. But there was a problem. Microsoft already had another operating system quietly gaining attention of its own, Windows, and this created a genuinely strange situation. Microsoft was simultaneously helping build one future with IBM while developing another path entirely on its own. At first, that wasn't necessarily a contradiction. Windows, in its earliest versions, wasn't remotely a serious commercial threat to anything. It was rough, limited, and hadn't found any real audience yet. But as Windows slowly improved, the balance underneath this arrangement began quietly to shift. Windows wasn't an overnight success. Early versions had plenty of limitations, and neither Windows 1.0 nor Windows 2.0 had done much to change the industry's broader skepticism about whether a graphical layer sitting on top of DOS could ever genuinely compete with a properly engineered operating system like OS/2 was specifically designed to be. But Microsoft kept improving it anyway, patiently, release after release. Then came Windows 3.0. On May 22, 1990, Microsoft released Windows 3.0, and this version mattered in a way none of its predecessors ever had. Microsoft's own historical account of this release specifically points to improved memory management as a major factor in giving Windows the momentum it needed to finally attract serious third-party application development. And that last part is genuinely critical to understanding everything that happened next, because operating systems don't win simply because the company behind them insists they're better. They win when people actually build things for them. More applications make a platform more useful to ordinary users. More users, in turn, attract more developers looking for a larger audience to sell into. More developers create more applications. And suddenly, almost imperceptibly at first, the platform becomes genuinely difficult to walk away from, for users and developers alike. Windows, for the first time in its short history, was actually beginning to develop exactly that kind of self-reinforcing momentum. Now imagine you're IBM, watching all of this unfold from the inside of a supposedly unified partnership. You have a partner. You're building an operating system together, sharing engineering resources, and a shared roadmap. But that same partner is simultaneously watching another platform, one it's separately building on its own, start gaining real momentum. This wasn't simply a story about two companies quietly disagreeing over software architecture. It was becoming a genuine high-stakes question of strategy. What should the actual future of personal computing look like? IBM had its own institutional priorities. Microsoft had its own increasingly separate priorities. And those priorities weren't always moving in the same direction anymore. However much both companies' public statements continued to describe a unified partnership. This is precisely where the Microsoft-IBM relationship became increasingly complicated in ways that went well beyond ordinary business friction. Because the underlying question was no longer simply, can we build an operating system together? The real question, sitting underneath every subsequent decision either company made, had quietly become, which operating system should actually define the future of personal computing? It's tempting to describe this story as one dramatic moment when Microsoft simply, decisively walked away from IBM. But that's not really what happened, and the more honest version of this story is considerably messier than a single clean break. The relationship became strained gradually, over time, rather than collapsing all at once. There were real, substantive differences in each company's development culture. IBM's more traditional, methodical, enterprise-oriented engineering process sitting awkwardly alongside Microsoft's faster-moving, more consumer-oriented instincts. There were genuine disagreements over priorities and technical direction. There were ordinary, unglamorous scheduling and coordination problems, the kind that quietly accumulate inside any large joint engineering effort spanning two separate corporate bureaucracies. And, increasingly, sitting on top of all of that accumulated friction, Windows was becoming a genuinely serious, independently successful force in the broader PC market, whether IBM's own institutional priorities had room for that reality or not. So the partnership didn't collapse because of one specific argument, one dramatic falling out captured in a single meeting. It was closer to two companies gradually, almost reluctantly, realizing they actually wanted different things from the same shared project, and that those differences had grown too large to keep papering over with continued joint statements about unified vision. And then came one of the most consequential turning points in the entire story. Microsoft and IBM ended their formal collaboration on OS/2, but that wasn't the end of the underlying competition between the two visions. It was the beginning of an entirely new phase of it, fought separately by two companies no longer bound together by a shared roadmap. After the split, IBM continued developing OS/2 largely on its own. Microsoft continued developing Windows, now with nothing, structurally forcing the two companies to move in the same direction, or even to coordinate at all. This is where the story becomes genuinely more interesting than a simple business breakup narrative, because Microsoft wasn't simply leaving an operating system behind out of disinterest. It was making a deliberate, genuinely risky strategic bet. A bet that Windows, still relatively unproven at the moment the partnership actually dissolved, could eventually become the platform developers and ordinary users, would actively choose over the more established, more institutionally backed alternative IBM was continuing to build. And Microsoft's timing, whether by careful calculation or simple good fortune, turned out to matter enormously. Windows was already gaining real momentum right as the separation was actually happening. The more people used Windows, the more attractive the platform became to software developers looking for the largest possible audience. The more software developers supported, Windows specifically, the more attractive Windows in turn became to ordinary users, evaluating which system actually had the software they wanted to run. That specific cycle, once it actually got moving, became an incredibly powerful, largely self-sustaining force, one that IBM, however capable its own engineers were, found itself increasingly unable to compete against on pure technical merit alone. So why did Windows eventually win the broader mainstream PC battle so decisively? There wasn't one single clean reason. It was an entire ecosystem reinforcing itself from multiple directions simultaneously. Existing PC users already knew Microsoft's software conventions from years of DOS use, lowering the barrier to adopting Windows specifically. Hardware manufacturers had clear, obvious commercial reasons to support the platform actually gaining real market traction. Developers had a rapidly growing audience worth building for, and Windows was increasingly becoming the default place where third-party software was actually being built, marketed, and sold at a scale OS/2 simply couldn't match. That matters, because an operating system was never really just the interface you happen to see displayed on your screen. It's the entire ecosystem surrounding it. The applications people actually rely on daily, the developers building and maintaining those applications, the hardware manufacturers designing around it, the ordinary users who've already invested time learning its conventions, the technical support infrastructure built up around it, the accumulated expectations an entire industry has quietly settled into. And once all of those separate reinforcing elements start genuinely feeding into each other, actually switching platforms becomes extremely difficult, regardless of how technically capable a competing alternative might be on paper. But there's another important, often underemphasized part of this story worth sitting with directly. IBM didn't simply give up the moment its partnership with Microsoft ended. OS/2 continued. IBM kept developing and supporting it for years afterward, releasing genuinely substantial updates. OS/2 2.0 in 1992, a real, ground-up 32-bit operating system capable of properly exploiting the full power of the 486, and eventually Pentium processors in ways Windows 3.1, still constrained by its older 16-bit legacy architecture, simply couldn't match at the time. IBM pushed further still with OS/2 Warp in 1994, specifically aimed at bringing the platform into the mainstream consumer market with improved usability. This wasn't Microsoft winning cleanly, and IBM simply walking away afterward. It was a genuinely longer, more sustained competition than that simpler framing suggests. OS/2 had real, substantive technical capabilities and a genuinely loyal, if considerably smaller, base of dedicated users of its own. But Windows had something increasingly difficult for any competitor to overcome, however technically impressive: raw market momentum. And momentum in technology markets, specifically, turns out to be one of the single most powerful forces determining long-term outcomes. A technically impressive product can still lose to a less impressive one. A product sitting inside a genuinely massive, self-reinforcing ecosystem can survive real, ongoing imperfections that would sink a smaller, more isolated competitor. And Windows, through the early 1990s, was building exactly that kind of ecosystem, at a pace IBM's own institutional structure simply couldn't match. The Microsoft-IBM breakup tends to get remembered in most popular retellings as a story about two large companies that simply couldn't get along anymore. But there's a considerably bigger, more instructive lesson sitting underneath that simpler framing. IBM had enormous institutional power, decades of hardware credibility, and a genuinely talented engineering organization behind it. Microsoft had enormous, rapidly maturing software, expertise, and an increasingly sharp instinct for building genuine ecosystem momentum. And both companies, in their own separate ways, were trying to predict what personal computing would actually become over the following decade. The truly important decision at the center of this entire story was never simply about which specific operating system happened to have the better underlying architecture in a laboratory comparison. It was about which company could actually build the broader ecosystem of developers, hardware partners, and habituated users that would ultimately determine what ordinary people actually chose to run on their own machines. Microsoft, in the end, bet harder and more consistently on Windows specifically as that ecosystem building vehicle. And that bet paid off decisively, eventually making Windows one of the single most defining software platforms in the entire history of personal computing. What's genuinely fascinating, looking back at the full arc of this story, is that Microsoft didn't actually begin any of it by deliberately trying to defeat IBM. Microsoft started this entire relationship as IBM's genuine partner, sharing engineering resources and a common roadmap, both companies sincerely believing they were building the future of personal computing together. But technology, companies, even the largest and most powerful ones, don't stay partners forever once their underlying visions start meaningfully diverging. IBM believed in one particular direction for the platform's future. Microsoft, increasingly, saw a genuinely different one. And Windows gave Microsoft a viable, independent path forward that no longer required IBM's continued leadership, or even its continued cooperation, to actually succeed. The formal partnership ended. OS/2 continued on its own, under IBM's sole direction, for years afterward. But Windows kept growing, kept adding developers, kept adding users, kept adding hardware partners, at a pace that eventually became genuinely unstoppable. And eventually, the very operating system Microsoft had originally been developing quietly alongside IBM, almost as a side project running underneath the officially sanctioned joint effort, became the platform that came to define the entire personal computer era. for the following 2 decades. The biggest lesson embedded in this entire story isn't really that Microsoft simply defeated IBM in some straightforward corporate contest. It's that Microsoft recognized something considerably more important and considerably harder for a hardware-focused company like IBM to fully internalize at the time. In technology markets specifically, the company that successfully controls the surrounding ecosystem can eventually become more powerful, more durably positioned than the company that controls the underlying hardware itself. IBM had built the physical machine that defines the entire personal computer category. Microsoft, through Windows, ultimately built something that mattered more to the platform's long-term trajectory. The accumulated software, the accumulated developer relationships, the accumulated user habits that made switching away from the platform genuinely costly, regardless of what any single competing operating system might technically offer instead. And Microsoft, through the early 1990s, was in the process of proving exactly that thesis, in real time, against one of the most powerful technology companies in the entire world. It's worth pausing, too, on just how differently this story might have unfolded had IBM made a handful of different choices along the way. Had IBM moved faster on OS/2's own marketing and consumer positioning, had it avoided splitting its attention across other, ultimately unsuccessful side ventures during this exact period, had its own internal culture been built for the faster, more consumer-driven pace? Windows' rise actually demanded the outcome of this specific rivalry might genuinely have looked different. That's not a minor throwaway caveat. It's a reminder that Windows' eventual dominance wasn't some inevitable foreordained outcome baked into the technology itself from the very beginning. It was the product of a specific series of choices made under real uncertainty by 2 companies each doing their genuine best to predict a future neither of them could actually see clearly at the time. But there's an even stranger, more genuinely ironic chapter still waiting at the far end of this same story, one worth holding on to as we close out. Years after this entire episode, years after Microsoft had gone on to fight an entirely separate, equally consequential battle against Linux and the broader open source movement, a battle that, at its most hostile point, saw a Microsoft CEO publicly comparing Linux to a cancer, Microsoft would eventually do something that would have sounded genuinely absurd to anyone, actually living through the OS/2 breakup in 1990. It began contributing code directly to the Linux kernel. It built the Windows subsystem for Linux, letting Windows users run a genuine Linux environment natively without leaving Windows at all. It eventually built and shipped its own Linux distribution entirely, running enormous amounts of its own Azure cloud infrastructure. The company that once fought fiercely to keep IBM from defining the future of the personal computer would, decades later, quietly fold a rival operating system's own code directly into the heart of its own flagship product. That's the thread worth sitting with as this particular story closes. Technology rivalries, however intense and consequential they feel, in the moment rarely stay frozen in the shape they first take. The company that once treated OS/2 as an existential threat to route around and Linux as a cancer to be fought off entirely eventually found itself building bridges to both, proof that even the most bitterly contested battles in this industry's history tend to end somewhere considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than either side could have predicted while the fight itself was still actually underway. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories behind the technology that shaped our world, subscribe to Hidden Historian. There's another story waiting to be uncovered,